Good morning, fellas. How we doing? It's a Sunday that I have a few hours to play with before I have some things to get done, shall we say. So, this morning, I'm going to take a gamble in the Tampa area for the all-mentioned L700. That was a weird saying. I don't think that made sense. But, yeah. L700, the Tropicana juice train. Made a whole video about this a few months ago. Heard that they're going to have a handful of Tropicana reefers headed for Bradenton, so between that and a grain train that I just heard about getting into town this morning, Tampa might be the place to be. And like I said, I've got a few hours to play with this morning, so I'm going to just head up that way and just kind of see what we find. L700 has changed so much in recent years. It'll be interesting just to look at that train in itself. But apart from that, not really a plan this morning, just kind of a gamble once again. So we'll take the gun and shoot it and see what we hit. The hit would come at Gibsonton, as I already heard L700 getting their EC1 authority to run to Bradenton before I arrived at Tampa. And EC1 is basically a verbal token that allows one train to be the only one allowed to use a certain stretch of track, as the entire Palmetto subdivision from North Riverview to the end of track in Bradenton is dark territory, so track warrants are needed for trains to be able to use any part of it. So with the train already coming south toward me, I'd set up at a location I had found just 3 days before on the chase of another train. Arriving to a couple of local folks having just launched their motorboat into the water, I'd set up on the Williams boat ramp at the Alafaya River. The wooden fishing pier adjacent to the recreational park and boat ramp provides a good vantage to see both the Riverview Phosphate Processing Plant and the CSX Palmetto subdivision to the east.
Alafaya 700. 700 over. Alafaya is 9 o'clock for your full move. 9 o'clock, here we go. Thank you.
With US 41 flying over in the foreground, the sun hasn't quite crested the horizon as L700 rolls south out of Tampa with some Tropicana empties from Cincinnati bound home for Bradenton. Though, lest we forget the changes they've made to L700 in these last 4 to 5 years, the train can now handle an exponentially longer list of customers besides Tropicana. Such includes these 16 loaded rock hoppers bound for the Conrad Yelvington in Palmetto. This would be the only extra duty for the crew this AM, but other days they can work almost any other Palmetto sub customer if necessary. And the business end is on the back of the train. Good old Tropicana, or at least what's left of her.
About 30 outside the market this place, somewhere. That sounds good, robot. Thank you.
I stuck around the Tampa area for a good while after this to stake out a few industries that I had been looking at before on maps, and to see if that grain train that had arrived that morning had any potential to move, but it didn't appear that that was going to happen, so eventually I hit 41 southbound to try and catch back up with the juice train. Thankfully, they didn't appear to be in much of a hurry this morning, as I caught up to the end of them by Sun City. I'd leapfrog them after this to Port Manatee. At milepost AZA 905.5 is Port Manatee Yard, and looking much fuller than it has in very recent years. Rather, this is the interchange yard for the Port Manatee Railroad that receives miscellaneous cars to deliver to customers inside the port. Curious also is this empty set of wet rock gonds inside the yard. We'll see in a future video where I cover the Bone Valley why these are here.
Port Manatee is another one of the many new duties that L700 could have stacked into its work list, but as I think is obvious with the speed of the train this morning, they wouldn't be stopping here today. Next stop on the way to Palmetto would be Bishop Harbor Road and the subsequent Moccasin Wallow Road, being the subject of many improvements with coming development from the US 41 intersection in the distance to the US 301 roundabout at Parrish. Roadway improvements come to an end about 500 feet short of this road crossing, leaving pretty much all of Bishop Harbor west of 41 the same way that I knew it to be growing up along this line all those years ago. And I imagine that this particular scene doesn't look too much different from when they first laid the road or the tracks here. In a day and age where most folks are deciding that Florida is the place to live, development is taking over these kinds of scenes at terrifying speed. Even just the drive on US 41 between Tampa and Bradenton that I've made in my lonesome or with family members over the years is hardly recognizable today. Passing beneath the interchange of Interstate 275, a couple of examples of this are right alongside the highway. At the intersection of US 41 and 73rd Street, a brand new 7-Eleven and McDonald's, not there just 3 years ago. A quarter mile further, a brand new RV resort with a community center and tennis courts. And not even around the same corner, more condos going up on the other side of 41. Just 5 years ago, all of this property shown was nothing but oak trees and palm fronds. But oddly, through all of this gentrification and modernization, downtown Palmetto still looks pretty similar. Some changes have been made, but most of the original pieces are still here. Also in downtown Palmetto is the lead switch to the Parrish Spur at milepost 914.6. Now a manually operated switch stand with high targets guards the interchange point. The so-called targets are those red and green panels which indicate to a train crew at a distance what position the switch is in, either green for normal or red for reversed in railroad terminology. The stand itself is one of the older Weir models, likely an original coastline installation, and the switch and stand are protected by a reinforced steel lock. While chasing a train in this territory about 7 years ago, I remember hearing a conversation on the radio where this lock malfunctioned, and it was stated that this lock was valued close to $3,000. Quite a chunk of change for a switch lock, but I suppose it is important to make sure these switches can't be thrown maliciously. Seeing as we're in dark territory, there's no safety measures to let a crew know a switch is thrown the wrong way until they're right on top of it. The inbound L700 stops just north of town to leave the Tropicana cut north of all the road crossings so they can cut off the rock hoppers and shove them up the spur.
Clear Friday night. About 10 more, so comment. 10. 5 more. Anywhere in there will do.
The conductor then lines the switch for the Parrish Spur, and here we can see how these old Weir switch stands operate. The lever is picked up and swung 180 degrees around a pivot which moves a connecting rod underneath the track which pushes the point rails one way or another. Once the points are lined and the stand is locked for the reversed position, 700 can then begin shoving the loaded cars up towards Conrad Yelvington about a mile away. The conductor walks back with the bottom of the train, ensuring that the crossings with no lights or gates protecting them have no vehicle traffic waiting to cross.
Alright, this crossing clear, another 3 to the next. 3. Alright, this crossing clear. Let me know when you could get under 4 and I'll pass it up. Under 4. Alright, must be riding, good for 20. Do 15 more, 1-5, looking out. 1-5.
The Parrish Spur here in Palmetto has always fascinated me as the tracks here run right through the middle of the parking and staging lot to the Taylor Fulton packing house on the left of the screen. The paved area also sees truck traffic from the recently revitalized Sudsco Incorporated building, one of the newer pieces to downtown Palmetto. From what I could find online, these guys specialize in laundromat and cleaning services, so this is either one of their headquarter buildings or a giant washing machine. Either way, the L700 slips through town pretty much unnoticed on a Sunday morning at 8, except for the drivers on parallel US 301. In around 10 minutes, the L700 emerges from Conrad with no empties to be pulled this morning. Now rolling off of what was the former SAL Sarasota subdivision to Venice onto the former Tampa Southern ACL line to Arcadia, the lines that our morningly local is using in such a mundane fashion today are hardly recognizable in what they were originally built as. A remnant of this lost infrastructure just barely holds on by the threads here in Palmetto. Directly behind us on the west side of the tracks is an old smashboard with a stop sign attached. The smashboard indicates the presence of the former diamond interlocking that crossed the Atlantic coastline and Seaboard Airline main lines. Coming from Turkey Creek and Parish, the Seaboard crossed the ACL right here in order to access downtown Palmetto slightly west of us. There was a good bit of industry on that stretch of track at one time, served by a handful of trains each week, but as businesses moved to Tampa and Sarasota, business fell off on lines all around this part of Florida, and the tracks were eventually ripped up as the two roads would ultimately merge together in 1967. The interlocking itself laid in the dirt adjacent to its original position for nearly 10 years after its removal, and was eventually donated to the Florida Railroad Museum, where you can find it on display in the center of our event field. Now one of the only remaining trains still carried by this former ACL main is the only train left that serves the Tropicana plant in Bradenton across the Manatee River. And to be fair, that practice is exactly what we've come out this morning to see, as that business too seems to very slowly be fading.
L700 calling Alpha Bridge Center, over. Alpha, go ahead. Yeah, we're ready for that big Manatee, over. Alright, get them down.
The Manatee River Walk in Bradenton is still a rather quiet spot at 8:30 on a Sunday morning, but there are some folks who have taken likely their one day off to get out early to beat the traffic and heat that inevitably come with almost every Florida day. Breaking the slumber this Sunday would be the creaks and cranks of the gears on the nearly 100-year-old drawbridge as it lowers for the return of the Tropicana juice train. I'm not entirely sure if the drawbridge itself was the original installation on this river span, but the span itself has been here since 1917. The former Seaboard route from Parish also had a bridge across this river about a half mile to the east, but it too was ripped up with the rest of the Seaboard's track that wasn't turned on to the former ACL after the merger. Now the half-mile-long ACL span is all that remains, and this morning it would be carrying 25 empties returning to the Tropicana plant in Bradenton. Not sounding like a large number, but with the numbers we're seeing today, this was enough to get me out of the house. It's also rather convenient that it worked out that this morning that they received such a, quote, bulk of empties that there wasn't much miscellaneous traffic coming in. It looks pretty much like the old juice train this morning, but believe me when I tell you that there are many mornings now that L700 will cross this river in the early AM with nothing but port traffic and rock hoppers in tow, no orange juice to be found.
Alright folks, that's gonna do it. That is just about as much time as I have to spare this morning, and it was a nice way to get out and follow an old train that I frankly grew up around back to Bradenton with what is quite disappointingly an impressive yield of Tropicana cars returning to this plant that started the legacy of Tropicana in 1946. I'm not going to follow these guys down into the plant in Bradenton here and see them switching, because that's an ordeal I've shot hundreds of times over the years. If you want to see that and the further journey of all the Tropicana reefers beyond the state of Florida, regarding those that go to both Cincinnati and New Jersey, take a look at my Journey to Jersey video that I did that covers quite a bit of what Tropicana has going on in the 21st century and 2025 for that matter. Y'all seem to like that video quite a bit, so if you haven't seen it already, give it a look, because there's a lot of good stuff to see and learn about in that video.
And with all that in mind, I do want to make a point before I end off here that I actually brought up in 2022 in a video I did with all the corporate bollocks that we've learned about Tropicana going through since then. At age 21, Anthony T. Rossi would arrive in the United States with $35 in his pocket and would go on to found this old Florida company, Tropicana, in 1946. And I still can't help, especially now, but wonder what old Sir Rossi would think of his old Florida Citrus Company now. On the CSX Palmetto subdivision, on the Manatee River at milepost AZA 916. This is Kotabeaner, and I'll see you around on the Sunshine State Rails.